Hey guys, so we're called the Audible. My name's Sean, and I'm joined by my co-host Shaw. And today we'll be going over our top 10 rankings in PPR for the first round of your fantasy football drafts. A little bit more about us. We're a fantasy football podcast dedicated to helping you win your fantasy leagues. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to my co-host, and he'll go over our first honorable mention.
All right, so very excited to jump into this. We'll go over the 10 picks in the first round, plus two honorable mentions. So we'll be starting with the honorable mentions first, and we'll go with our first one, Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. So I think together we've said he's around 12 in our composite ADP. And I think really when we're kind of talking about Jonathan Taylor, the question when we're looking for the 2026 season is which half of the season are we getting from Jonathan Taylor? Are we getting the first half or are we getting the second half? I think a big question everyone's going to want to know is what will this Colts offense look like without Daniel Jones? And even when Daniel Jones comes back, will he be the same guy that was, changing everyone's mind to start last year? So I think Jonathan Taylor, player still has the talent to be an RB1. Now you can't bet against that talent. That offensive line is incredible. So the pieces are there. We're just kind of scared to see, can this offense sustain drive? Can he get the amount of touches that an RB1 gets where he can put, RB1 performances on the board? So that's going to be our question to see. I think we have him at our RB5. So we have four RBs ahead of him in the first round. But yeah, for my end, that's kind of what I have for Jonathan Taylor. How about you, Sean? Anything that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, that's some great input right there. I think Jonathan Taylor, he had a terrific year last year, especially during the first half. And I think, in my opinion, we can expect a little bit of regression heading into next year. The Colts were the number one offense in the league for a large portion of last year, but personally, I can't see that happening again. Like you mentioned earlier, I think that the Daniel Jones injury was very severe, and coming off that leg injury, the question is, can he come back in peak shape like he was in last year? I think that's to be determined. And I think it would be a little bit reckless to assume that the Colts are just going to hit the ground running next year and be that number one offense, scoring all those points that we saw last year. And moreover, on that topic, I think with Michael Pittman gone, that's a very big hit to the Colts offense in terms of their downfield prowess. And I think that JT's value dips a little bit because of his lack of pass catching work in comparison to some of the other elite running backs. And I think that because he's not catching these passes, a lot of his fantasy production is going to come down to scoring touchdowns and red zone opportunities. And without that, without an elite offense behind him, I think it's going to be a little bit difficult to replicate what he did last year as what was the RB1 for the first half of last season.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you just put down. I think, that's the main question for Jonathan Taylor. What does this Colts offense look like? We got to see a glimpse of them really, exceeding expectations. They've kind of been very mid, I would say, throughout the years. They've had the pieces. Everyone said, this is their year. And they've
Mhm.
kind of always just come out looking very average. Last year, obviously, beginning, they did not look that average. So, hopefully they can come back even without Daniel Jones and Pittman re give some semblance of that number one offense. And of course, with
Right.
Daniel Jones, hopefully we get to see him coming back and just
Right.
completing the comeback story that we all thought we saw last year.
Definitely.
Yeah, so
All
I
right,
think,
so moving on, our next honorable mention is Omarion Hampton. Now, me personally, I was very high on Omarion Hampton. I actually had him at number nine on my list, and I think that he looked really good last season before the injury, and he had all the components of a successful RB1, including rushing volume, goal line work, and pass catching. And I think that, he's a first round NFL draft pick. He's 6 foot, 220 pounds. He's a prototypical NFL running back. And I think that going into next year with healthy right tackle and left tackle and Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt, as well as McDaniels as the OC and Harbaugh as the head coach, I think the recipe for success here is hard to ignore. So I think that overall, Omarion Hampton's profile fits the bill for a successful RB1. And I think while there is risk considering we haven't really had a large sample size of him having success, I think there's a lot of untapped upside here, and I think that he's going to be in for a really good season if he can stay healthy.
yeah, I mean, I agree with all the points you just made. I think the sample size is definitely very small for the amount of NFL games and NFL touches we've seen from Omarion Hampton. But before he got hurt, man, he was he was looking great. And I think that Najee injury really sustained to his workload. But I think, if you're if you're the Chargers right now and you're getting a guy like that back, you want to get him as involved in the game plan as possible. And I could definitely see
Definitely.
that being the plan with him. So yeah, I think just with everything we saw from him last year, hopefully he can continue and just build upon that, rookie year that he had and doesn't catch that famous sophomore slump. All right.
Definitely. Definitely.
So I think, now that we're done with our two honorable mentions, move into our consensus 10th pick, who
Yeah,
we
let's do
have
it.
Cedee Lamb from the Dallas Cowboys. And I think Cedee Lamb is a guy who's proven he is the number one receiver in that room. But looking at all the other receivers, I think will go in the first round. And then looking at Cedee Lamb, one thing that really scares me is, I think he's definitely a one, but is he the 1A or is he the 1B? I think people will lean 1A, but there will be many weeks throughout the season where, no, Cedee Lamb fans or Cedee Lamb owners will be questioning, why George Pickens is getting so many touches, so many targets, so many touchdowns. He is that kind of guy that can easily take the spotlight from Cedee Lamb. So I don't think we consider him one of these elite receivers in our first round, but I think if you get out of the first round, take Cedee Lamb 10 and then get the 1-2 turn right there, you'd be a very happy manager.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are all great takes. And me personally, I think CeeDee Lamb, he's been a very dominant fantasy receiver for the past couple of years now. But I think that this year is a little bit unique in the sense of, like you said, is he the wide receiver 1A on the Cowboys? Or will George Pickens take over as the best receiver? I think we saw last year that it felt like at times he lost a step. He had some major drops. There was a lack of really big games. And over the last 2 years, it kind of feels like he's missed a good amount of time with injury as well. So you got to wonder, with him creeping up in age and him and Dak Prescott not looking like they're always on the same page, will there be a little bit of regression going into next year? And then in addition to that, in terms of a pro CD argument, I think you could make the claim that the Cowboys, they have a really bad defense. And even though they've made some moves this offseason and just last night they grabbed Caleb Downs in the draft in the first round, I think you could still make the claim that they're going to be playing from behind a lot next year, and that's going to create more pass catching opportunities for CeeDee Lamb. So while overall I think that there is some uncertainty regarding his workload going into next year, as well as can he stay healthy on the field, I think that he still is a very strong fantasy option, and he's a guy I'd be looking at if I'm picking in the late first round.
Definitely agree with all your takes though, I think we definitely do have some takes where we are questioning what we're going to see as the output from CeeDee Lamb, but bottom line is he is a first round wide receiver pick. He
Definitely.
is, a top receiver in the NFL. And, we'll see a couple guys, we'll talk about a couple guys above him, but uh, managers should be very happy with landing him.
Definitely. Definitely. All right, so moving on, we have another NFC East wide receiver, and we're going to be talking about Malik Nabers at the number 9 spot. So heading into year three, Malik Nabers suffered a leg injury in week 5 of last year against the Chargers that cut his season short. But before then, he had a very dominant game against the Cowboys, scoring a last-minute touchdown in regulation that should have won the game, but unfortunately didn't for the Giants. Um, and that's also coming off the heels of a very promising rookie season where he broke records for receptions and he had over 1,200 receiving yards as well. So personally, I think for Malik Nabers, I had him a little bit lower on my boards. He actually made my honorable mention category, but I think that there's a lot of upside here going into next year with a young quarterback in Jackson Dart, a vastly improved offensive line. The Giants retained both of their tackles from last season, and in addition, drafted a new right guard in the first round of the NFL draft this year. So there's improved protection possibilities for next year. Malik Nabers, he's a one-of-a-kind athlete who could stretch the field. He's good after the catch. He can do just about anything you ask of a wide receiver. But there's going to be questions of how good is the Giants offense going to be next year? Can they put the pieces of the puzzle together and really have a dominant season? And can Malik Nabers reap the rewards of that?
And I think all of those are very good points. And I think I was a little bit higher this year on Neighbors. As you know, we talked about it last year. I was very high at him at the same spot too.
Right,
But
right.
I think looking back at that rookie year and seeing what he did, compare that offense for the Giants to that year versus what they have now. What they have Dart, they have more offensive line protection. They have Scatterbo to give some more room in the run game. No, I think there's just so many more dangerous weapons outside of Neighbor, and he's is obviously the alpha on that offense. So I'm just really looking forward to see how he builds off. You know, not really last year because he didn't get that full sample size. He only got those 5 games. You touched on that Dallas game where he had a monster game. But he had other games where he had multi double-digit targets, and I think you see a lot of reception volume for him. And then if you have an offense that can really put the pieces together, you also look at the new coaching staff for the Giants as well. A coach who's come from a lot of success in Harbaugh. I think, good things are lined up for Malik Nabers. And I think this might be considered a little bit of a reach compared to where the ADPs have him as of today. But I really like Nabers at this spot.
Yeah, and I think as you alluded to with Malik Nabers, talent has never been the issue. He's a guy who can do a little bit of everything. He's the alpha receiver on the team, and he's by far the best playmaker on that offense. But I think what it's going to come down to is can the offense put the pieces together? Like as you referred to, they have a new head coach in Harbaugh. They have new offensive lineman pieces. They brought in a lot of new receivers in the offseason. Can the Giants sustain drives and score a lot of points that can make Malik Nabers super fantasy relevant and really achieve that wide receiver one status?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big question to see. I'm very bullish on him, but we'll see when football kicks off in September.
Yep, for
So
sure.
moving on to our next player at the number 8 pick, we have James Cook. So, I think last year when we were scouting James Cook, one of the things we were really worried about is this man too touchdown dependent? I think the year before that it was 18 total touchdowns he had, and we didn't really see any of those big runs, those breakoff runs. Last
Hmm.
year, you know, we did see those breakoff runs. So he had a monster year last year. I think there will always be that problem of Josh Allen running that tush push where,
Yeah.
it's proved very effective and that will vulture James Cook's touches. But he really
Hmm.
showed us that he is a top running back. He is an RB1. And I think if you watched the Bills last year, you'll be able to kind of see that kind of play from him. I think, he's not only a guy that can catch the ball, he can take it from out of the backfield, he can take it long, he can hit the home run ball, and he can do a little bit of everything in this game. I think a lot of people were looking at his backup. Would he take any work away from him? And I think he's kind of solidified that, workhorse position currently.
Yeah, yeah, all great points. I think that James Cook is a great player on offense that'll score a lot of points with Josh Allen under center. And I think that they'll often be playing in positive game script, which will allow them to run the ball more and in turn give James Cook more opportunities to score fantasy points. He gets touchdowns, explosive plays, he catches passes, just about anything you could ask out of a running back. And while he might not necessarily be a top tier athlete like we see out of like a Jahmyr Gibbs or a Bijan Robinson per se, his situation is good and he produces year in and year out. So I think at the end of the day, James Cook is a really solid option as a RB1 if you're looking in the first round. I remember last year, Shaw, you and I, we were kicking ourselves because in the third rounds of our drafts, we would take Alvin Kamara over James Cook.
Yep.
So not going to make that mistake again this year, but yeah, he's a great player.
Yeah, I think definitely he has burned us in the past. We have been kind of skeptical of him, and he proved us wrong last year. So excited to see what
Yeah,
he does this year.
yeah.
Well,
All right, cool. So moving on to our number 7 spot, we have JSN on the Seattle Seahawks, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. He's coming off a Super Bowl victory and a breakout season. Personally, I had him on my fantasy team last year, and he did wonderful things for me. He's a great receiver who dominates in play action. My biggest worry with JSN is the Seahawks ran the ball at the highest rate in the league last year, and JSN had an absurdly high target share, over 40% last year. And if the Seahawks continue to run the ball at such a high rate, is it reasonable to expect that JSN can, replicate last year's production? I personally think that JSN's probably due for a slight dip in production just because it would be so difficult to be as efficient as he was last year. But nonetheless, I think he's one of the best receivers in football. He's very dominant and he's put in a scheme that's aiming to get him the ball as much as possible. And so I think that at your 7th spot in the first round, I think JSN is a very good play.
those are all really good points. I definitely do think that amount that the Seahawks run the ball is a very good point to bring up. For me, I think At 7, I really like JSN there. I think, a lot of people might have him higher, but I am kind of skeptical to see what happens with that Seahawks offense next year. We were bringing up that rushing rate, and you look at their number one running back from last year, Kenneth Walker, the Super Bowl MVP, no longer on the team. Now, Zach Charbonnet was really good when he was the starter on that team, but can he consistently do that all season? I know they drafted, now, funny enough, the RB2 in the 2026 NFL draft was the RB2 of Notre Dame. Kalen Black, I believe his name is, was Jeremiah Love's backup. Although I don't know if you'd really consider him a backup, but if he can step in and him and Charbonnet can carry that workload in the rush like they did last year, I think then we could maybe see JSN starting to um, not meet what he was able to do last year, but start to replicate some of that. Another thing I'm very skeptical of is his target share in that Seattle offense. They don't really have any other receivers who can make plays for them like JSN does. Now that JSN has had this breakout year, and teams will get to watch his full year tape and try to scheme against him. Will this hurt him as he is the primary weapon in their passing game? That if you're looking to defend the Seahawks, you have to harp on JSN. So that's something I'm also skeptical to see what happens this season. Definitely, I think there are better options in the first round at wide receiver. But again, JSN, we saw what he did last year. He's a wide receiver one. And I think he's a guy you can be pretty confident if you take him at 7.
Yeah, yeah, make no mistake, he's a first round wide receiver, like you said. But the question is, where amongst all the
Mhm.
receivers in the first round, where do you take him? And I'll say, for me personally, I'd say he's about my wide receiver 4 heading into next year. I think that he's a great option, but there's just 2 or 3 guys that I would much rather prefer to have over him.
I definitely agree with you. And with that, we'll go into talking about one of those guys we'd rather have. We have at our composite pick of 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. And, what else can you say about Amon-Ra other than this guy is a tough, durable, consistent wide receiver, consistently been putting up great numbers for about the past 3 years now on a very talented offense. I think one thing about that Detroit Lions offense with Amon-Ra that's great is his workload is so heavy. He gets so many receptions, just eats them up. And he doesn't really have anyone to take away from his workload. He has Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta. These aren't high volume guys, but they are guys that demand respect when you're defending. So Amon-Ra St. Brown has a lot of time to do what he wants to do. Defense has to treat everyone on the lines, all their weapons, and he's able to find so many ways to impact the game. I think he's one of those receivers that he can make plays on any level of his route tree. Not the flashiest, he's not going to take you deep. That's more of a JMO play, but he is my wide receiver 3, and I think the past 3 years have shown you why.
Yeah. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think he's a great player in a great system. He's a receptions hog. He's dominant out of the slot. He's a tough receiver who historically hasn't really missed many games either, which is really important when we consider fantasy football. He might not be the most quote unquote athletic guy in terms of like size, speed, vertical jump profile, but he knows how to get open, and year in and year out, he produces in his system. So you can't knock the guy. And the Lions offense, I do want to note that I think that they struggled a little bit down the stretch of last year without Ben Johnson, and they eventually ended up missing the playoffs as well. But me personally, I still have trust in Dan Campbell and the Lions offense. I think they have a lot of weapons in that more often than not, they'll figure it out next year. So I think Amon-Ra St. Brown's a very strong receiver in your first round. He's consistent, he's dependable, he gets the job done. And yeah, I currently have him as my wide receiver 3 heading into next year. Cool, cool. So now moving on at our number 5 spot, we have Christian McCaffrey, running back for the San Francisco 49ers. And with CMC, I think that Shaw and I have a little bit of a disagreement in terms of where to rank him. I had him as high as the second overall player on my board, but I know that Shaw, you'll touch on how you feel on him a little bit later on in this video. But a big thing with CMC is he's the perfect fantasy running back. He's in a great system. Brock Purdy, his quarterback, is healthy now. And yeah, the 49ers historically have just scored so many points with Brock Purdy, CMC healthy. Age and injury concern is always going to exist for CMC, but I think the opportunity is just too good to pass up on. Historically, CMC has either been the RB1 or he's missed half a season or more. So CMC is a very strong option heading into next year. And I think that if he's on the board, it's very difficult to pass up on him. But at the same time, it's a very risky play because there's always that chance he's going to get injured and then he's going to miss significant amount of time. But the thing with CMC is if he doesn't get injured, you're almost guaranteed to have a great fantasy player. So at the end of the day, the gamble is on you personally, and it depends on your risk appetite. But me personally, he's the second player on my board, and I would, yeah, I'd be very, very excited to take him in fantasy drafts next year.
So yeah, I mean, all very good points. I think for me and like the disparity we had in CMC's ranking, I think you brought him up as, as high as the second, highest player on your draft board. For me, I have him a little bit lower. He is my RB3, so only I have one RB higher than him compared to your list, but he is my overall seventh pick. And I think, you brought up exactly the point that I was going to touch on, which is CMC is the ultimate boomer bust fantasy game. You don't really know what you're going to get from a draft day. You're going to be nervous until the season starts, and then you just don't really know what you're going to get. You're about to flip a coin, and hopefully it lands on the side that he booms. I think when you look at the 49ers offense and how he fits in there, I think he's the perfect fit. He is a guy that was a little bit younger and a little bit more durable throughout his career. I would love to jump on taking him earlier, but I think with my philosophy of the first round, you really want guys who you don't have to worry about. Of course, there's always worries about injury in fantasy, or maybe if you take a wide receiver, his quarterback might get injured, which might affect him. That is kind of the game, but at the same time, you can hedge against that risk. I think for me personally, my risk appetite, especially in the first round, you kind of want to get a guy who's pretty stable, who you're very like you could depend on. You're very calm about him. And I think CMC is kind of the opposite of that. I will say I was very low on him last year and definitely got burnt. So I think if you are looking to fade CMC, there is a high chance you're going to get burnt. You have to accept that, but at the same time, depends how willing you are to take that risk, what your risk appetite is, like Sean said. And, I think we're kind of on the same page with that. I think you're a little bit more willing to take the risk than I am, but I think, different fantasy managers have different philosophies, and CMC is one of those guys who different managers with different philosophies will tell you different things about how you should approach him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I just want to clarify, not only is he my RB2, he's actually the second overall player on my board. So I'm very, very high on him.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think to your point, I think at the end of the day, it's all about risk. A lot of people in the first round, they like to take a guy who has more durability because at the end of the day, what you want out of your first round pick is a whole season's worth of production. And with a guy like CMC, there's a very large probability that he does get injured and he misses a significant amount of time next year. But at the same time, if he is healthy, there's a very large chance that you're going to get very elite level running back play from CMC. So at the end of the day, the choice is up to you depending on what you believe is best for your team and how you want to construct your rosters.
Yep, all good points. So moving on to our next player, I believe in our fourth composite spot, we have Puka Nacua. So as I will say, I was a Puka Nacua manager last year, and it was what a year it was. I think, when you really look at the outlook for 2026, that Rams offense was firing on all cylinders. Matt Stafford, MVP year. I think we're bound to see a little bit of regression. I don't think the passing offense specifically will be as dynamic as it was last year. Does that mean we will see, Puka's stats, drastically drop? I do not think so. I think he will still be a stable producer. I think he will still be very heavily involved in the game plan. They loved giving him runs, giving him the jet sweeps, just putting the ball in his hands any way they could. I think that's just going to be a trend that continues. And, if they have Matt Stafford in the backfield, even if he's not MVP Matt Stafford of 2025, I'm very, very, very excited for what that means between that connection. Another thing to touch on is last year, one thing we saw a lot is that Puka Nacua really didn't get much of that end zone production. When they went into the red zone, it was all Devontae Adams. So moving forward, getting this offseason, getting another offseason together, it's gonna be interesting to see what the red zone target share looks like. Maybe does Puka start to get more of those red zone receptions? If he does, that kind of hedges out whatever slight drop we might see from that Rams offense. But that's kind of how I'm looking at him. He's my wide receiver two on the board. So definitely very high on him, my fourth overall prospect on the board. And yeah, I think if you get Puka Nacua, you'll be a very happy manager. I will say the offseason allegations and the offseason antics have been a little scary, but I think with everything that's been reported, I think the Rams organization and just the people around him are keeping that in check. So I don't really see any concerns for the next season, but I definitely think that will be something to monitor.
Yeah, yeah. Overall, really great analysis, very in depth. I think just to touch a little bit on Puka Nacua, he's a great receiver, coming off a dominant wide receiver one season. He's dependable. He's in a great system, having a veteran like Matthew Stafford throwing him the ball and getting to play alongside guys like Devontae Adams and Kyron Williams. The system is great, and they performed very, very well last year. But I am too expecting a slight regression as Stafford is coming off an MVP year. History usually tells us that it's very likely that quarterback play tends to come down a little bit following an MVP year. So I'm not going to bet against the trend in this case. And to talk a little bit about the offseason activities as well, I think that it is a little bit of cause for concern in terms of where Puka Nacua's mindset is at and what's going on with that. And it's a little bit questionable, his actions. But me too, like I'm not going to overthink it. I think that Puka Nacua is a great player, and I have trust in the Rams organization to watch over him and make sure he's doing okay mentally and that he's going to get through whatever he's going through and he'll be ready to go when the season starts. So until I hear more news, I'm not going to get worried about this right now. To me, it's just off-season noise. And I think that Puka Nacua, he's the wide receiver two on my board. I think he's coming off a dominant season. He's in a great system. He checks all the boxes. So I think going into next year, he's a very strong option if you're looking for a wide receiver in the first round, and he's still on the board. So now moving on to our third spot, we have Bijan Robinson, running back of the Atlanta Falcons. So Bijan Robinson, this offseason, the Atlanta Falcons, they lost running back Tyler Algier to free agency. And this is a big boost to Bijan Robinson as it'll give him more goal line opportunities. In the past, the Falcons would often pull Bijan Robinson out at the goal line right when he did a lot of work to get them down the field. And this in turn would annoy a lot of fantasy managers such as myself, who, were hoping for a big game out of Bijan Robinson. And I think that with these additional goal line opportunities combined with Bijan Robinson's tremendous athleticism and feel for the game of football, he's a very strong, very, very strong option going into next year. And in fact, if things go right, I could even see him ending the season being the RB1. But I think the reason that I have him a little bit lower on my list is because I expect that Atlanta Falcons offense to have ups and downs given the state of the quarterback room. Whether it's Michael Penix or Tua Tagovailoa playing quarterback, I think that there's going to be games where the offense looks really good, and then games where the offense can't really seem to get it going, similar to what we saw last year. And I think that no player, regardless of how talented they are, can outperform a bad system on an every game basis. Just because, football is a team sport. There's 11 men on the field at a given time. And if, regardless of how good Bijan Robinson is, the other players have to be doing their jobs as well to ensure he can get those opportunities to hit home runs and score touchdowns. So while there's a lot of upside with Bijan Robinson and there's a tremendous amount of individual talent, I think that the system he plays on kind of lowers his draft appeal to me just a little bit. But at the end of the day, still a very strong profile. I have him as my RB3, and he's my fourth overall player on my board.
Some great takes, some great analysis. I definitely agree with. I have him as my RB2 on my board, my number three overall prospect. I think that's where you had CMC as your pick. And no, I think you touched on the loss of Tyler Algier. I think we were both Bijan managers, and that was one thing that was very frustrating seeing. And it seemed like it happened all the time. And I know anyone who's had Bijan in the past probably was crying tears of happiness from Bijan. Oh, and Tyler Algier left. But I definitely understand your points about Tua Tagovailoa and Michael Penix. What does that quarterback bring to this offense? Needs that whole need 11 players to be on the same page and to be doing the right thing and doing their job. And Bijan Robinson can't be the one to change. On the other side, I do see the upside. He is a player who can do anything. He's a running back that can catch the ball, run the ball, hit the home run ball, you know, anything. Get the ball in Bijan's hands, he will make plays. It is very I think a lot of people are very bearish with Tua on the Falcons. No, I don't know about the Falcons, performance in terms of records and where they end up on the standings, but one thing I will say about Tua, to his credit, is that he was really able to sustain a very fantasy relevant Devon Shan. And I know when we would watch the Dolphins play, we looked at Devon Shan and said this guy's a wide receiver sometimes. He's running legitimate routes out the backfield. And being an A-Chain manager a couple of years ago, once Tua got hurt, that passing upside all went away. So one thing I am curious about to see is, can Tua unlock that same kind of passing upside in Bijan? Not to say it hasn't been there in the past. We've definitely seen it with Bijan, but it seems like it was a different level with Ashan. Let's see if he could do that with Bijan. Maybe it was really just the system that we're in that Tua was able to do that, but I think that's one thing that I am curious to see. But I definitely think Bijan is one of those running backs you could definitely take as an RB1 and be very confident in him. Now, he might not have every game where he's putting up 20 plus points, but he will, there will not be many games where he does not do that. So I think Bijan is a great pick this high. We have him as our number 3 on the composite. I think he very much deserves that slot.
Yeah.
So moving on, now we're going to our number 2 pick, and we have wide receiver Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. And, you know, everyone's been able to see what Ja'Marr has been able to do since he got into the league. And I think he's one of those rare receiver talents that just has always kind of been a stud, has always been a number one guy. I think when you look at Ja'Marr Chase, really what you're looking at is a ceiling of a Triple Crown winner. And his floor is really just, you know, a solid wide receiver one. I can't really see anything, lower than that if Joe Burrow is healthy and that Bengals offense, is functional, then I'm not too worried about T. Higgins. We've seen the past couple of years T. Higgins has been there. He has bit into the workload a little bit, but that tends to happen when you have such a dynamic passing offense. I think Ja'Marr is a guy who can get you 20, he can get you 50. There will not be many times where you'll be upset with his output. I think, personally, I had him as my wide receiver one, of course, and my number one overall pick. I think I had him at the same last year, but I'm very high on Ja'Marr Chase this year.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's hard not to be high on Ja'Marr Chase. In my opinion, he's the best receiver in the game of football with the top five quarterback throwing him the ball and a really bad defense that forces the Bengals to pass a lot. And last time Joe Burrow played a full season, Ja'Marr Chase triple crowned and heading into, the 2025 fantasy draft, a lot of people were taking him at the 101 spot. So, if the top three running backs are off my board, top two running backs even, he's very much so my number one overall pick. I think that there's a ton of upside here. And like you said, there's a floor too, where even if Joe Burrow gets hurt, Ja'Marr Chase has been able to perform as a solid wide receiver one consistently. So I think that with Ja'Marr Chase, there's a very high floor here, and there's a super high ceiling as well if, Joe Burrow is able to stay healthy and the stars align and everything goes right. Um, yeah, so not much more to say on Ja'Marr Chase. Great player, great system, very good fantasy football player. All right, so moving on to our 101 spot, we have Detroit Lions running back Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, man, with Jahmyr Gibbs, everything clicks. He's fast. He gets a ton of receiving work. He's playing in a high-powered offense with a lot of other weapons that complement him, like Jameson Williams, the deep threat, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's dominating the slot, creating separation. And now his running mate, David Montgomery, is gone. He's left for the Houston Texans, and the Lions brought in running back Isaiah Pacheco, but I think there's a possibility that Jahmyr Gibbs sees even more work than he has in previous years. And in fact, already in the previous years, Jahmyr Gibbs has been a top five running back in fantasy. So with this additional workload, the sky's the limit. So I'm going to be really interested to see what the Detroit Lions scheme up with Jahmyr Gibbs and what happens next year. I do want to point out that at the end of the last season, the Lions offense had a little bit of a struggle with the departure of Ben Johnson. And yeah, and I just want to note that I still trust the Lions and Dan Campbell and their offense to have success next season, although I did just want to point out that little slowdown at the end.
Yeah, all good takes, Sean. I think when you talk about Jahmyr Gibbs, he's just a pure running back. He's
Yeah.
super athletic, super agile, can hit that really fast top speed and take it to the house. And, I think the biggest drawback on him, obviously, as you mentioned, was he had David Montgomery that he had to share the carries with. David Montgomery was, that short yardage back. You take up a lot of those high value carries in the red zone. I think you lose that. I mean, you gain Isaiah Pacheco, but I don't think Isaiah Pacheco really poses a threat to the opportunities like Montgomery once did. So I think, when you look at Gibbs, he's really just a Ferrari, and he's always kind of had a shackle on the wheel, and now we're going to get to see that one taken off. So I think he had a lot of those games where you'd see, maybe the game script would really favor Monty, and you'd really only see Gibbs having like, 6 to 12 touches, nothing really to, catch fire and really take it to the house. So hopefully we'll see really consistent weeks of him just getting a lot of touches. He'll still probably cede some vultures too Isaiah Pacheco, but I think you know he'll really live up to this 101 ADP, and I think we're in for a big season for Jahmyr Gibbs. And like you said, the uh, the Detroit Lions offense may not be as high powered as it once was with Ben Johnson, but I really still trust them. I trust Dan Campbell. I trust all those playmakers, and out of those playmakers, I think Gibbs is the best one they have. So,
Yeah.
I think we're both in consensus with that. I think, a lot of people are going to be really high on Jahmyr Gibbs this year.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for watching. Please like this video, comment, and subscribe. And we're going to continue posting weekly fantasy football contents for you here on this page.